Welcome, everybody. Tain Nix here, back on the Expat Files. I have a very special guest today, Nick Hudson, a gentleman that I met through a network of mine, the Mavericks Project. More on that anon, because we do have a live event coming up. And if you think you're Mavericks material, you're going to want to know about this. We're heading to Dallas in November, so I'll talk about that toward the end. But Nick, I first encountered, I think it was through a webinar. I heard you speak. And the moment I heard you talking about, and this was back in the lockdown years, which we're not going to delve into, best left alone. Least said, soonest mended on that topic. But when I heard Nick speak, I was instantly, I would say, moderately hypnotized, because Nick has that rare ability to explain difficult topics in a way, and not just that other people can understand, but also Nick has like a proper moral sort of compass heading in his life, and what Nick is doing with his work in private equity, and no doubt in other fields as well, because I heard you speak during the lockdown years about your ability to interpret data and all the rest. And so, Nick, welcome. I'm super happy to talk to you. This is a big deal to me. I was out sailing for the last 2 days, so I hope people can. My complexion doesn't look too bad, but yesterday I was fried like a lobster, and so welcome. Thank you for being on. Why don't you start off with just an introduction, folks who don't know you, talk about sort of whatever portion of your life you care to share, and how you got into private equity and how you became the fine fellow that we see before us.
Well, you're very kind, Tain, and thank you very much for inviting me to be on your show. It's a long story to summarize half a century of living, but I'll try and encapsulate it. Where I've ended up is, as you correctly say, as a private equity fund manager. I operate in Cape Town, South Africa, and the fund focuses on South African investments, and it's done well. We've just recently raised our second fund, and so we carry on with fighting the good fight of sensible investing, and trying to ignore the sort of sexy flavors of the month, of the moment.
That's beautiful. We're definitely going to talk about that. Yeah, because I caught an
sure.
interview that you sent me, excuse me. And I just thought your approach to stuff is, again, like so sensible. Like there's such an opportunity out there. We're going to talk about this in a second. But please continue, because that was one highlight that I really wanted to touch on too.
I think, old-fashioned common sense becomes a valuable commodity in a world gone mad, and our world certainly has gone mad. But just a very short version of how I got to where I got to. I was born into a middle-class family that all believed that the way to get ahead in life was to become a member of a profession, become a doctor, become a lawyer, an accountant, whatever, and then to go and work for a company. But it turned out that I was totally unsuited to that kind of world. And over the course of probably something like the first 15 years of my career, I gradually worked out that I was a generalist, and B, somebody who valued independence very highly. So I eventually managed my way out of that kind of middle-class trap, and into a position of running a very independently structured private equity company, and that suits me very well.
Were you
And then along the way, I also picked up this bad habit of picking up on crusades. Starting in 2020 with the lockdowns, I immediately saw that the whole COVID thing was a fake crisis, and that the reaction to the purported crisis was going to be devastating, and I couldn't sleep with the fact that I was being silenced. So I spoke out for the first time in my life, and that put me on a certain trajectory of understanding and personal growth. And I haven't stopped talking, although I am, I think, a very heavily censored and shadow banned individual. That's for sure.
Probably. Yeah, probably. Anybody who put two and two together early was definitely a target in that time. And you're on a new crusade. So we'll segue into that. You're on a new crusade, but I'm curious about your background. Were you trained as an attorney? Where did you develop the thing that made me reach out to you, and this is a bit of a departure for this channel, but that's okay, because finding interesting people with, high level developed skills it's always worth learning from such people. Where did you develop your critical thinking skills. Like, where did that come from? Mavericks Project is a private community focused on powerful connections, trusted information, and time-tested solutions to create and preserve wealth during our epoch of extreme change. The Mavericks Project was born out of the social, economic, and geopolitical schism that kicked off in 2020. A small band of contrarian misfits spent the lockdown years observing problems, analyzing the implications, and plotting solutions. Now, several times a year, we Mavericks get together in fun and fascinating locations to talk about solutions to the social dangers to your family's safety and how to avoid them, the increasing state surveillance and how to negate it, the rapidly declining U.S. empire and how we want to position for what's coming next, the risks to your family's generational wealth and how to protect it. If you think you have what it takes to be a Maverick, this is your chance to come make new and better friends with some of the most accomplished people you will ever meet. Join us from November 4th to 7th in Dallas, Texas for 3 unforgettable days of action, discussion, and answers. The link for the event, along with all the details, is below this video.
I think it came more from a lifetime of reading and also of mobility. I had, by the time I was sort of leaving school, on my way into university, I think I'd changed schools 10 times. I'd lived in a couple of states in the United States. By the time I hit 30, I'd lived on 3 continents, and moving around and combined with reading a lot, I think helped me develop that kind of capacity and just being a naturally curious person as well. I always want to dig a little deeper and understand a little more and corner the expert at the cocktail party to pick his brain on whatever he knows. So yeah, that's it. 1 part inclination and 2 parts circumstance. And yeah, I do have a qualification that sort of most people would recognize as meaning something. I'm an actuary, qualified actuary. So I had an undergraduate degree in mathematical statistics and so on. And I guess, yeah, that helps.
So you have a big numbers kind of brain, a la Ed Dowd, and the guys who were most on top of the shenanigans that took place and that are still taking place were guys who knew how to read statistics and crunch numbers and make sense out of big data.
Yeah, look, that stuff's always come easily to me, but it's not my natural way of thinking. I find myself and will describe myself to other people as a much more intuitive kind of person. I look at complex situations and my tummy moves me in one direction or the other, and I begin to perceive maybe a slightly different structure to reality than most people would see.
That's very interesting.
That's why I ended up very happily in private equity, because that's exactly what's required in private equity.
Beautiful. Well, we're going to talk about that. That's very interesting. What did you gravitate to in terms of reading? You say you read a lot. I had a phase of my life where, and I was homeless by choice. I actually lived in a park in Charleston, beautiful town, Charleston, South Carolina. I slung a hammock up in a tree, and people would be in the park, and lovers would come make out on the bench below me. Nobody knew I was up there, but I would spend all day, every day. I would read an entire section of the Dewey Decimal System. I discovered, I don't know, Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, and I would just read every damn thing I could get my hand on. And I spent hours and hours doing that, really on and off for 20 plus years. Did you gravitate toward one? Like, what did you read? What really captured you? For me, it was the Western canon of literature, like real literature, classical literature, because I found authors who had touched upon questions and themes and disturbing things about the human condition that really spoke to me. And it was like, oh, look at this. I understand what literature is. It's a record and a compendium throughout the ages and centuries of deep, well thought out people trying to tackle the same kind of things that troubled me about what I was dealing with in my life. What did you gravitate toward, and what was that formative portion of your own self-education?
Well, I had a few heuristics that I would use to try and identify quality. I don't have, I didn't for most of my reading life have any kind of particular area or subject area that I would zero in on. I read quite widely. If there was one area that I had to choose that I'd read more in than anything else, it would be epistemology, the theory of knowledge. And the reason for that is I found it practically very, very useful. It's sort of, in a way, it's the uber subject, the one without which you can't make sense of any. Everybody's got have a good theory of knowledge if they're going to really develop subtle understanding of any complex phenomenon. So that was kind of the emphasis. But I had little rules of thumb. For example, I would strongly favor books written more than 50 years ago, because if they continued to be recommended 50 years after being published, then they had to contain, or were more likely to contain, substantial truths. So I avoided bestsellers, and it was so often the case that a book was recommended to me only to be completely forgotten by the general public or even intellectual public a year or two later, to just sort of fade from the limelight, having been on the bestseller list. And so avoiding reading all of those. Memoirs of CEOs I will never read, because they're always these terrible revisionists. There was one that I vaguely enjoyed, but Peter Drucker's memoirs. But apart from that, I found them the most shallow and pointless books to read.
Self-congratulatory. Yeah.
Yeah, self-congratulatory and revisionist like you won't believe. That everything gets reduced to an elevator pitch, whereas the real life is much more complex, and decisions were made in vacuums and without knowledge of the decision maker even.
Fascinating. Well, what you just said means we could easily go beyond the hour mark. I'll encapsulate this, and we'll see if we want to go deeper into it. Epistemology. I studied medicine with an old healer in Guatemala who just passed away this year. God bless him. He was, what a fellow. For about 9 years, I had an apprenticeship. And what this really turned into was a deep, deep study of epistemology. I think of epistemology as the denominator. If you think of it this way, like all logical systems are based on certain axioms, right? Like, for example, because my specialty was medicine, I became very clear on the fact that Western, modern, high-tech, mainstream medicine is deeply, deeply reductionistic. There's no other, all the axioms are based on, well, truer reality exists at the molecular level and the cellular level, and we're going to reduce reality down to these tiny, tiny points of physical matter. And so you get this heavy bias toward, like, well, if there ain't no physical evidence, you ain't sick. And it's like, well, we know that's not true. That's not how the human animal works. Like, thoughts are things. The Asian epistemology is, of course, utterly, utterly different, but in a very complementary way that I think very few people understand. It's taken to be a kind of, people have a kind of eclectic smattering of knowledge about the whole thing that New Age people in the West break down the Eastern epistemology into is your mind creates reality. And it's like, well, not exactly, right? That's a gross oversimplification. But in medicine, and here's the short version, Asian medicine is based on pattern discrimination. The best medical system does not diagnose you based on reductionist kind of criteria. Their axiom is that, look, this is connected to that, right? And the reason this matters is it's the ultimate system for treating chronic illness. Why? Because chronic illness always involves multiple factors. You cannot reduce it down to one factor. If it was one thing, it would have healed already. And so the reductionist epistemology in Western medicine is limited. It is very, very, very effective at emergencies. Treat the body as a machine. We know this works. Your heart is a pump. Keep it pumping. This kind of thing. Oh, you got a bullet hole in you. Stop the bleeding, right? It can do certain things from the emergency standpoint, but it's awful. It actually has negative value for most people with chronic conditions, and negative value in this case implying that if you get a lot of modern emergency kind of medical care for your chronic condition, you're worse, right? You end up causing damage that you can't even put your finger on exactly how that's happening. And they don't have a way of thinking about chronic illness. And this became very clear to me. I wrote a book about it. It was my entire journey was, like you, a crusade to try to get people to understand, like, no, if you diagnose according to patterns, you have much, much greater agency, facility. I mean, ultimately what this comes down to is the patient herself has the ability to manage and control and recover from chronic conditions at a much, much better, a much higher level, much more facility dealing with chronic conditions. Well, since the entire world is mired in chronic illness at this point, and the emergency medical system has given us great gifts and saved millions of lives, and we've all used it, and thank God we have it, but the modern patient population, right, the epidemiology of modern life is chronic illness. And so this Asian thing has real value. But again, the reason I lay all that out is like epistemology is like the denominator underneath your axiomatic assumptions. You believe certain things are true without questioning them. In the West, individuality, reductionism, right, et cetera, et cetera. In the East, it's utterly, utterly opposite, and in a very important way. And just like all great, I mean, we're in a conflict, but not really a conflict with the East. It's a conflict based out of ignorance, and that there's a very important lesson to be learned from Asian epistemology, and this is nowhere better illustrated than in the medical systems. And so I had a deep investigation and a period of my life where I had a kind of obsession with epistemology because I felt like I was yelling into the void. Most people, of course, will never be able to think beyond their cultural axioms. The things that you are told are true are just bloody true, and you better not question them, or else, you know, you start to cause friction with the people around you, as I learned to my amusement, but also to my chagrin. Ultimately, I left medicine to become a writer because it was the only way I could continue. There was nowhere else for me to go, right? So in any case, fascinating that we have that also another point in common that mattered to you growing up. I don't know anybody who talks about epistemology, quite frankly.
Yeah, no, I know one or two people that, but funnily enough, they tend to converge on pretty much the same philosophical school, which is these days referred to as critical rationalism,
Mm.
um, kind of a derivative of Popperian epistemology, or a successor, if you like. There's quite a lot to pick up in what you spoke about, and maybe I'll just choose one. That idea which you framed as sort of a perception of Asian philosophy, that it has to do with you create your mind creates its own reality, or something close to that. I mean, I think where I would land is that the mind is a representation of reality, if you like, an algorithm running on the hardware or wetware of our brains, a very complex algorithm, and one which we have no hope, I believe, in ever approximating in silico, with algorithms running on computers. And to an extent, there's a great deal of self-reference going on inside every mind. And so there's there's a way in which that perception is necessarily true, or that perceived perspective is correct. That the mind does, to a degree, create itself, but it's almost a trite observation. I don't think it's particularly useful. Might give future programmers a few ideas as to how to make artificial intelligence actually intelligent, instead of just dumb automation, which is all it is and all it shows any promise of being.
Yes.
Yeah. And on the medicine front, I couldn't agree with you more. I think this reductionist approach, this tendency to imagine that complex problems can be solved by inductive or deductive reasoning, is a terrible false start in so many areas of science and society. And it's a great failing of the Western medical literature and practice, that it does conceive of the human body as a much simpler system than it is, and one that really is addressable in terms of sequences of what essentially amount to just so stories, salt bad, fat bad, cholesterol bad, whatever.
Yeah,
Vaccines
a
good,
binary kind of checklist, right? Of
yeah, yeah.
criteria.
And that's so far from the truth, and it's better to sort of, I think, to go through life with a much more intuitive and holistic, or broad-based kind of appreciation of the body as being incredibly complex, as our environments as being incredibly complex, and with a close eye on what has worked for humans in the past. When have humans looked healthy? Was it in 2020 or 1920? And what was different about what they did then and what we did now, and try and sort of intuit some of the key changes, and reverse those. So, for example, I mean, when it comes to nutrition, I'm all aboard the reduced carbohydrate diet story, the reduced processed food story. I don't take any additives or supplements. I think it's all a load of nonsense. I think most of them.
Expensive urine.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, don't even do anything or probably are poisonous. But and then I try to get sun and exercise, and that's about it. I don't get more anxious about it than that. I don't obsess over a paleo diet or a low carb, high fat regime. I just have a general tendency to not do the things which have increased in prevalence at the same time that people have got fat, sick, and ugly, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, stop and think about this. Like there was a whole revolution, right, in modern medicine of we're going to have evidence-based medicine, everybody. It's like,
Yeah, it's a
what
nonsense.
what exactly were you doing before that? You understand?
Yeah, it's a crazy view because I just think in many settings it's almost impossible to insist. Well, you can insist, but it's stupid to insist on the structuring of a randomized control trial with a placebo arm and sufficiently large number of people in the study to get there. I mean, that'll work in a couple of very narrow settings, but for the most part, it's just you've got too many variables. There's too much going on. The complexity of setting up those experiments is a bit mad, and so I kind of find myself saying, well, you know what? Actually, most of this is probably just harmful anyway. So whilst I'm great fans of surgeons who can stitch people's arms on after car accidents and so on, I'm very skeptical of most of clinical medicine, especially the branches related to psychiatry and diet and oncology. Those do seem to me to be domains of incredible charlatanry and quackery.
That's my
Yeah,
experience. Yep,
yeah.
yep. Fascinating. We could certainly stay on the track of epistemology and medicine for the remainder of our talk, but we won't do that. You are a crusader now. And I saw an interview because you sent me a link to check it out. I don't know that I assume that was fairly recent, seemed like it. Talk about what you've discovered. You've found a deep vein of value and profitability in your private equity life and your career track there, doing something that I haven't heard anybody else talk about this. Maybe there are other private equity firms doing what you're doing, but it's fascinating because what you're crusading against is so damn obvious. It's such an obvious place to get leverage over a company that's being horrifically run based on really dumb ideas. Can you talk about now what you're doing, what you're up to today, and how you've tapped into this opportunity to just sort of like slowly turn the ship on companies that are really operating on really bad, dumb ideas, and the kind of people that you've encountered there, and how that kind of work is received as you go in and sort of troubleshoot these companies back to profitability?